Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us here at the Center for Public Leadership this evening. Today's event is fittingly titled after our special guest, Barbara Kellerman's book, Leaders Who Lust, Power, Money, Sex, Success, Legitimacy, Legacy. I'm pleased to introduce both of our guests today, Barbara Kellerman and David Gergen. Barbara Kellerman is the James MacGregor Burns Lecturer in Public Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School. She is the founding executive director of the Center for Public Leadership here at HKS. And from 2003 to 2006, she served as our center's research director. She has held professorships at Fordham, Tufts, Fairleigh Dickinson, George Washington, Uppsala, and at both Dartmouth and the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. She is author and editor to many books on leadership and followership, including and highlighted tonight, Leaders Who Lust, Power, Money, Sex, Success, Legitimacy, Legacy. Moderating tonight's discussion is David Gergen. David is a professor of public service at the Kennedy School, where he co-founded the Center for Public Leadership. He served at the White House to 4 presidents as an advisor, and is currently a senior political analyst at CNN, and as you may have noticed, has been very busy of late on CNN. So thank you both for taking time out of your busy schedules to share your knowledge and insights with us all today. Join me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. We're all both honored to be here tonight and looking forward to a conversation. And I'm glad to see just among the people who have shown up on the screen, I've already seen Ron Heifetz. And Ron and Barbara and I go way back together. We work together to help get the Center for Public Leadership off the ground. Barbara has been a provocateur in leadership studies for these many years. She is someone who has asked the questions that need to be asked about the leadership industry, as she calls it, but are not addressed widely. Barbara is one of the few people with the guts and the gumption to say, hold on here, let's pause and figure out what these leadership studies are all about. And I must tell you that Ron Heifetz has been a real pioneer in this field. So it's good to see you here, Ron. Thank you for joining us. Barbara, I think what you've got, this must be your 17th, 18th book. You've got another one coming out on the enablers of Donald Trump around the corner, and I believe you have somewhere down the line another one on love, but we'll see. Opening a whole new chapter in your life if you move from leadership to love. But let's get there through lust.
That's not a bad way of doing it. Exactly.
Well, tell me, how do you have you must have had a couple of late night drinks when you decided to write a book on leaders who lust. Tell me what's going on. Why this book? I'm really curious.
So as you know, David, this was co-written with a gentleman whom you know, a colleague named Todd Patinsky, who was with us at the Center for Public Leadership for several years, and then decamped for a tenured position at Stony Brook University. He and I have remained friends as well as colleagues. And we had talked for some time about doing a book together. And we wanted, as I always do, to do something that no one else has touched, that no one else has done. And as we were talking, we came up with this idea. And it is, as you said, David, I tend to do things that other people haven't, or at least in different ways, and raise all kinds of questions. So this book is a departure. First of all, it is descriptive and not prescriptive. But second of all, it talks about something that not only do leadership types not talk about, but the academy more generally. There's very little on drive, and certainly not on lust as we define it. And as you know, we've given it a very particular definition.
Right, and this is similar to the book on grit, or another book on drive. You know, both of those I think were thought that they were seen as breaking new ground. And for you to come in on lust, now tell me what the central lessons you've learned from studying this subject. And we heard from Kevin the breakdown into the six different groups. But first, give us an overview of where you've come out.
Well, if I can beg your indulgence, I'm going to read just one paragraph that kind of, number one, describes it, and number two says a little bit about what we concluded. So let me just read this one paragraph. It begins the epilogue of the book, and it begins as follows: lust matters. It might seem curious, but when we start writing a book such as this one, both of us generally know where we're going and what we want to say, but not specifically, not exactly in this case. In this case, we knew generally that despite its being completely ignored in the 21st century leadership literature, lust has been of significance in the past, and we're certain, therefore, to be of significance in the present. But until we did the research, until we started putting flesh on the bones of our cases, we ourselves did not fully appreciate how much of a driver lust is, nor did we fully appreciate the symbiosis between lust and leadership, or that some leaders who lust are exceptional, in part certainly precisely because of their lust. To reiterate, leaders who lust have a fire in their belly that is impossible to douse. Leaders who lust have a life force that is impossible to slow, not to speak of stop. And leaders who lust have an appetite so enormous and relentless, it is impossible ever fully to satisfy. Thus, lust is a trait or an attribute or a characteristic that must be singled out. It is leaders who lust who mostly make history.
That's very, very helpful. One of the surprises for me in the book was that ordinarily, if we talk about lust, it has a negative connotation, right? I mean, people who lust are just by definition people who lose judgment. They become obsessed, and they're unpredictable. And I would think that, as the most part, there's too much drive. There's a narcissistic quality about it that we associate. So, and so given the negative connotations in which it's normally discussed, I was surprised that you had people like Bill and Melinda Gates that you cited for their lust, but there was lust for legacy. I was surprised to find Mandela as one of the people you featured. Tell us more about. You've sort of come out in a neutral place. The question is, to me, lust for what? May define how you size it up morally.
Well, even lust for power can sometimes have good consequences. So you're absolutely right. The way we use the word, it's value free. It is descriptive. It does not have a value assessment. You know, certainly, David, about me, that I'm as interested in bad leadership as I am in good leadership. Yep. By the way, I should say every step of the way when I talk about leadership, I talk about followership at the same time, including in this book. The word leader is often used as even by me as shorthand, but I always think in terms of the system. So this book talks about the leaders who lust, but it also talks about their followers and why followers follow, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not for good reasons, leaders who lust. And it talks about the context within which lust is embedded. Mm-hmm. So for example, to take one very obvious example, the word lust typically is used either in terms of lust for sex or lust for power. And right. Those are two of the words that we focus on, two of the lusts that right. we focus on.
Almost to the exclusion of the rest.
Pardon?
Almost to the exclusion of the other.
100% to the exclusion of the rest. But just to illustrate the importance of context, we have stories, I do not call them cases, we have stories about two men who lusted for sex. One was John F. Kennedy, and the other one was Silvio Berlusconi. And the context, one case, the United States of America in the early 1960s, and the other is Italy, slightly later, but not that much. But those are two totally different contexts. So the consequences of lusting for something depend not only on the leader, not only on the followers, but also on the context within which lust is being played out.
Yeah, come back to the leader who lusts for power. And drive, sort of essentially drive, I think, as you've described it. When is it beneficial and when is it not? You're the James McGregor Burns lecturer, and he was pretty clear about, not wanting to call bad leaders leaders.
Well, as you may know, probably do know, David, I have not, he called a bad leader a power wielder.
Right, exactly.
I do not do that. I try always to write for ordinary people, like readers of the New York Times. So I long ago decided that for me, the word leader was itself value free. Almost always, the word good is, certainly at the Kennedy School, the word leader usually implies good. As in, I want to be a leader, meaning by definition, I want to be a good leader. I'm teaching people how to lead. I'm teaching people how to lead wisely and well. But in the real world, some people who are leaders are bad, and some people who are good, and some leaders are good. So the real world doesn't use the word power wielder, and so I don't use it.
So, okay, I get that. Tell me can you give us a couple of examples of leaders that for power who actually worked out to be positive leaders who were people who were inspired their generations or changed history?
Right. Well, interestingly, one of the distinctions between lust and drive, or lust and grit, or some of the vaguely analogous words, is that lust, as we define it, is completely, by definition, insatiable. My favorite line about that is Churchill's line about Hitler, which he delivered this wonderful line in 1938 to Parliament that was essentially not listening, warning about Hitler. And the line was, his appetite grows with eating.
Yeah.
In other words, the more he eats, the hungrier, instead of being satiated, the hungrier he gets.
So,
And
go ahead.
Yeah, just to finish the point, to answer your question. And so it is with power, which for early on tends to be often used for good, even in the examples that we have in the book, that we focus on in the book, which are Roger Ailes, who was, of course, the legendary media mogul, most famous for Fox News, and Xi Jinping, who has been a leader of China since 2013. Both Ailes and Xi Jinping, and I want to be careful here because we know lots of different kinds of people are on the call, but I want to be clear that they both change somewhat over time. That a lust for power, people who lust for power tend to want more power as they keep on going. So, for example, Xi Jinping in his earlier years was not particularly that different from his immediate predecessors. As time went on, however, again, vaguely analogous to Roger Ailes, who, as time goes on, they become that much more, as lust starts to consume them, as power starts to get to them, they seem to want more, and it starts to take a somewhat different form.
So power does corrupt.
I would answer that absolute power corrupts absolutely. I would not say that power corrupts, but when you lust for power, in other words, you want more and more and more of it, then I would say in the end, one could argue. But again, for example, in my current class, I have some Chinese students, and I want to be clear here. These are not value judgments. These are analyses of what is, and then people can form their own assessments.
Yeah, it's interesting when we started out that last little exchange, we started talking about people who lust for power being a positive, and very quickly we got over to insatiability. And we didn't pause long on the benefits. It was mostly about how as they grow more powerful and ever more powerful, they're ever more insatiable, ever more narcissistic, and ever more dangerous to society. certainly.
Again, I want to be clear here, David. Power is not of itself a bad thing. So Xi Jinping, before he became that much more power hungry, was by most assessments, and certainly by the Chinese people, an outstandingly good leader. So it depends again what your metrics are.
It was interesting. My own experience has sort of taught me that people often start out not looking for power. Then early in life, people start having a lust for fame or fortune, and they tend to be a pretty lousy people for a while. But it's when they go from being for themselves, instead of being, I want to be a leader for to satisfy me, and rather they become leaders for others, that they're dedicated to others. They have that larger cause, as John McCain would say. That's when they become very powerful, and they turn the lust for power into something good for society. FDR is a good example of that. He was sort of a dandy, and he wanted fame, and he just enjoyed the good life. But after polio and having that crucible in his life and coming back, he developed he was still ambitious, but he was ambitious for others. He was ambitious for saving people. And I'm wondering if there's not, you described it as going the other way. You get more insatiable as you have more power. But I wonder if there's room in your analysis for people who actually improve over time.
Well, I'm not sure that I would characterize Franklin Delano Roosevelt as having a lust for power. I'm not sure that I would use that term for him. And I want to just go back for
he lust for fame.
I'm sorry. I would say once he found himself in the situation that he was in, which was in 33, the Depression, and then later that decade, a world war, I think he wanted to succeed. I don't think he was interested in the way, again, we define each of these different lusts. And the lust for power is a ceaseless craving to control. I'm not sure I would say about Roosevelt that he had that. I think he was interested in success, in combating the Depression, in winning the war. I think he was completely consumed by that. I just want to say, return to the word metrics, David, yes. Because even someone like Roger Ailes, who is now so widely derided, another example of a lust for power. Again, there are 5 other lusts. But even Roger Ailes, who's now so widely derided in part because of the sexual harassment scandal, what he built with his lust for power, this media behemoth, Fox News, has been arguably the single most successful media creation, largely by a
it's not clear.
Single man, to this day, incredibly powerful. Right. So again, depends on the metric, It
depends on the lens you're looking through too, because Roger Ailes, to many other people, would be regarded as he took his lust for power and he built Fox and he damn near destroyed the country.
100%, and I've written about that as well. No question about it. He destroyed. I wouldn't say destroyed. He certainly damaged a bunch of women. He had a toxic culture, organizational culture. Damn near destroyed the country. I would agree 100% with that. I think the power of Fox News is, in fact, in the Trump presidency, in fact, has generally been, you can't say enough about it, underestimated. But again, what's the metric here? Our argument is that these leaders change history. It's not about good or bad. It's that they leave an imprint. Leaders who lust leave an imprint that those of us who are in the business of studying leadership and writing about leadership and teaching leadership and talking about it should take into account. These are standouts. These are extraordinary leaders.
Yeah. Barbara, there were very few women in your analysis, the stories you told. And I'm wondering whether there's a difference in your mind, a gender difference with regard to lust.
Okay. Yeah, a great question, which we address in the prologue to the book. Yeah. So first of all, the easy answer is there have just been fewer women leaders, whether in private sector, public sector, United States, globally, there's just been fewer of them. So that's one reason. More interesting question is, do women lust in the same way? And if they did, to which, by the way, we have no answer. We say that in the book. We that's not something we can not, these are great questions to which we do not have answers. Do they lust in the same way? And even if they did, David, would they dare show it in the same way? So the men that we talk about are generally only too happy to have their lust front and center, whatever that lust may be.
Yeah, Eva Peron had a quality, but she enjoyed flying out there. Don't you think Thatcher did?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear who you're saying.
I said Eva Peron, but I was also moving on.
Yes, right, yes, right. By the way, we tended to, one or two people, one person has died since we wrote the book, but we tried to write in the main about contemporaneous leaders, either very recently alive or in fact, still very much alive.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about Margaret Thatcher?
I'm good with Margaret Thatcher. You know, I think she was one of the rare examples. You have only to see this season's episode of The Crown and you get the idea. By the way, Queen Elizabeth, who is somebody we considered having in the book, this is one driven, you know, she's not generally seen as lustful as that word is usually used, yep. But her sense of dedication and duty and devotion, her endless, insatiable desire to succeed in the role of being the Queen of England is noteworthy and arguably someone who belongs in the conversation as much as does Margaret Thatcher.
Oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting. There are a couple of other areas I'd like to hit if we could, before we ask for questions from others here. And I'm going to ask Ron Heifetz to get us started when we get to that point. He's still here. I'd like to ask you about the obvious, the big gorilla in the room, and that is, and it's going to be that his followers, I gather, will be a subject of one of your next books, and that, of course, is Trump and his followers. Tell us your take on that whole side of that story.
Yeah, well, he's, you know, it's interesting, David, since he has refused since the election, which by general consensus was won by Joe Biden, to admit defeat. It's as if he's a sort of poster child of a leader who lusts.
Right.
The interesting thing, and he will, again, to define a leader who lusts, what distinguishes these people from all the others is they will be like, they're insatiable. No matter how much they have of what they want, they're going to keep at it till they're dead or until some external force stops them. Mm-hmm. So the interesting question about Donald Trump, to me anyway, among the million interesting questions, by the way, a comment about followers. As I said, they're as much a part of the conversation as our leaders. You can't understand Trump without looking at his base. The base, that incredibly considerable segment of the American population that remains dedicated to this man, even 4 years later, what some of us would consider, I'm sure you have gone on record, David, as arguably the worst president in American history. They remain passionate followers. So you can't separate him, and by the way, because of them, so are most Republican senators. One could expand the circle and talk in increasing numbers. But the phenomenon, in other words, is not just about the leader, it is about the leader tied to the followers. The interesting question to me about Trump is what is he lusting for? So if you look at his entire life until very recently, it would seem to be what he described himself as, and we have this quote in the book. He's not a character in the book, but we have the quote from him. He described himself as, I'm greedy, greedy, greedy. And he used the term greedy, the word greedy, to describe his lust for money, lust being our word, not his, to describe his endless quest for money and for more money. And there are books of evidence that testify excuse me, to his endless zeal, not only to accrue more and more and more money, but to not part with the money that he has. Now, the question about him is, have the 4 years and we could have a good discussion, we're not going to have the time to do it, but an interesting conversation is, has that zealous appetite, that nonstop insatiable appetite, been shifted from a lust for money to a lust for power as a ceaseless craving to control? Or does it all somehow tie back to his lust for money so that, among other things, when he leaves the White House, he has been threatened with severe financial consequences for reasons we don't have now to go into? But his lust has been lifelong, not for power, but for money. And I would say his presidency gives evidence until, again, very recently, he didn't want to boss people around. He wasn't that interested in the presidency per se. He was interested in what it did for him, for his brand, but not in governing.
Right. Well, Trump could easily be a candidate or a person who has more than one lust. He qualifies for several of these areas, certainly for power, for money, for sex. And I'm told by people in the White House, he actually cares about legacy, which is surprising me because he's been destroying it as he goes, but nonetheless. But I want to get to the questions on the floor, but I want to come back to and just allow people to hear you. You have been eloquent and persistent over the years in taking on what you call the leadership industry. The disappointments that you've had along the way, and how we're investing lots and lots of money, but we're not figuring out how to get it right yet. We haven't figured out how to get the metrics yet. Can you walk us through where you are now and your thought about that? Because I don't think some people at the Kennedy School have been exposed to that, but a lot have not.
Yeah, so in the book I wrote previous to this one, which was called Professionalizing Leadership, I explain how I came to be where, thank you, I explain how I came to be where I am. So David, I've been in this line of work, myself, a card-carrying member of the leadership industry for many years, as you well know.
Yes.
And it's a relatively new industry. It's maybe 40, 50 years old. People have always been interested in leadership, but what I would call the industrialization of it is relatively recent. Now, we began, those of us who've been around a long time, with the highest of hopes. However, I started getting interested in this subject when I realized that if you plotted a graph that on had one axis that was the burgeoning leadership industry over the last 30, 40, even 50 years. So in other words, that's gone straight up. More money, more energy, more schools, more programs, more courses, you name it.
You said billions are now being spent.
Yeah, I mean, leadership development, private sector, public sector, high school, all over the place, people are developing leaders. Let's just talk about the United States for a moment, although this is a global phenomenon, certainly in liberal democracies, which is a separate issue, the difference between autocracies and democracies. So that's gone straight up like an arrow into the air. At the same time, our trust in leaders, our belief in the competence of leaders, our respect for leaders, our faith in leaders, our belief that leaders are doing a good job has gone down precipitously since the 1960s and 70s. So I started asking myself, what is the leadership industry not doing that other lines of work? Let's assume it's like a job that you can learn. And the answer is, in my view, this is just me, obviously speaking for myself, we are not doing what the other professions do to get leaders to where they need to be. So if you want to be a doctor, you're going to be educated in medicine, you're going to be trained in medicine, and you're going to be developed in medicine. And I distinguish among those three steps, and they need to be done, again, in my view, in sequence. And it takes years to do that. You don't just take a course, you don't just take an executive program, you don't go away for a long weekend, you don't do a few sessions in a large organization. It takes years. So one of the models, and by the way, the ancients, the Confuciuses and the Platos and so forth, they all thought, as I'm thinking, it takes years. And by the way, the military, again, I'm talking about the American military, is as close as we come in the United States to having a model that I think all of us should emulate. So if you, for example, go to West Point, you're going to get educated, you're going to get trained, and lifelong, you're going to get developed. And I would love to see Harvard, for example, have a program where it takes an undergraduate and plucks them out. It's a special fellowship or scholarship program, 2 years at an undergraduate school, then they get a fellowship to the Kennedy School, and they spend 4 years learning how to lead. That's how I think it should be done. Again, like medicine and law and engineering and education, and by the way, even the vocations do a better job of systematically trying to educate plumbers and hairdressers and taxi drivers and bus drivers.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very interesting. Barbara Tuchman, the historian, took on this subject, and the appendix to one of her books actually, she came to the conclusion after studying several civilizations and how they tried to educate, train, and develop their leaders, that nobody had succeeded at it very long, even going back to the classic periods. And she then also concluded the most important thing that in fact you can help people build is character. And if you can focus on that, if you can succeed on that, you've gone about as far as you can and reaching your goal. So I think I hope you continue to press some of these arguments, because we do have, it seems to me we do need to advance beyond where we are now. Let's let Ron Heifetz ask the first question. I see he's still here, and then Kevin, we'll go from there.
David, if I can just say one more sentence.
Sure.
You mentioned character.
Yes.
Most respected of all American institutions remains, even in this day of distrust, the American military. Yeah. And their emphasis on building character as a part of leadership, learning, training, education, you name it, is critical. And I would argue we in the civilian sector should learn some lessons from the American military.
You might, if you have a chance to visit Stanford in the new program, the Knight Hennessy program, they've raised $750 million to invest in leadership, education, training, and development. Ron, over to you.
Well, thank you, Barbara. I've had the pleasure to know you for just nearly 40 years, and to have read just about all of your books, except I don't think I ever saw the early works on Willy Brandt, but I bet those are really great.
Good memory.
And I agree with both you and David that working these questions is really critical, and it's also critical to view them from a teaching and prescriptive point of view in regard to how to render people trustworthy to the powers that they seek when they gain positions of authority, and to be trustworthy against the temptations that will both be offered to them, but also as those external temptations are resonate with their own internal hungers. I wrote about this in my second book in 2002 in a chapter called Managing Your Hungers. I didn't call them lusts, in part because of David's point that so many of these hungers are normal human needs, like the hunger for food or water. And they get us in trouble when, for one reason or another, as a product of our background, usually, we generate the vulnerability of having just what you described, an insatiability, so that the hunger becomes exaggerated and then begins to take control of us. And we lose the capacity to discipline that hunger and to deploy ourselves then in a way that's trustworthy, so that people with a normal hunger for sex, end up violating other people's sexual boundaries, physical boundaries, and do enormous amount of damage. And people who are hungry for significance end up, if it becomes an exaggerated hunger, or as you would say, a lust, fall prey to the temptation of grandiosity, where their need to be important and to be the person who always has the answers for people can no longer tell the difference between what they do know and what they don't know. Or the hunger for control and power is a normal human need. Every child wants to feel a sense of agency. Nobody wants to feel powerless. But on the other hand, exaggerated, as you're describing, it can distort one's sense of mission and lose any sense of purpose, where the goal is to simply maintain one's control or authority in a situation. And I also agree with both of your, you distinguish these different hungers, but my guess is that you also agree with David that these blend together and overlap in different ways, because people's hunger for sexual gratification can end up combining with their hunger for power and in different ways, and or their hunger for significance, and the hunger for power and significance can begin to also overlap. So, I mean, I think it's great that you've written this. I've just purchased it on Kindle, and I'm looking forward to reading it. About 25% of the course that I started teaching back in January of 2002, which I'm now teaching as a full semester course, about a quarter of it's devoted exactly to these. I'm not calling them 6 different hungers. I'm mainly talking about the hunger for validation and self-importance, the hunger for power, authority, or control, and then the hunger for intimacy and sexual gratification, in order to help people figure out what are their vulnerabilities and how might they anchor themselves to become more trustworthy in situations where they're undoubtedly going to find various temptations. And I think you're also absolutely right that the corrosion of trust in our society has become its own pathological problem. We have 78 million people who don't trust 72 million people, and 72 million people who don't trust 78 million people. And between social media and cable TV, there are incentives, both industrial and political incentives, to keep deepening the distrust and the polarization. So the challenge of repairing trust has a lot of different components, but one component is rendering our people who will seek positions of authority to have the strength of character to be trustworthy to these temptations.
So I just a couple of comments, Ronnie, on what you said. Thank you for your comments. First of all, I appreciate that both of you have drawn attention to the overlap. As I keep telling my students, and I had the same experience when I wrote Bad Leadership and Followership, people are not widgets. In other words, you can't perfectly pigeonhole them. So we described the lust that was the most salient. But the larger point I want to make is to return to one I made in the beginning. I don't want us to get hung up on the notion of lust as something that by definition is bad and therefore needs to be controlled. So let me give you a couple of examples from the book. I'll give you 2. One is a man by the name of Larry Kramer, who became consumed at one point in his life with securing, particularly for gay men, but of course the movement was broadened, what we call in the book legitimacy. And he had that, he lived much, he was quite ill, but he lived to be quite old. He died, as I said, he's the one that died since the book was written. And he was consumed by this. He was consumed by the lust, the insatiable desire, insatiable drive, insatiable hunger to gain legitimacy for gays, lesbians, transgenders. He more than anyone else, at least in my view, spearheaded what was originally called the gay and lesbian civil rights movement. The other person or couple that we talk about is, again, a positive lust, I think we would agree, is Bill and Melinda Gates. Bill Gates is his own, fascinating example of 2 separate lives. He essentially quit Microsoft at a relatively young age to devote himself endlessly, passionately, insatiably to philanthropy. He and Melinda Gates have not only spent their lives, by the way, Warren Buffett has given essentially most of his fortune to them to dispense because they have done it so with such deliberate forethought and passion. Bill Gates and Melinda Gates will do this philanthropic work until they can do it no longer for whatever set of reasons. And they are consumed by a desire various desires to very specifically to change the nature of education, but most aggressively, in the best sense of that word, with regard to disease, particularly malaria, polio, and now, of course, Bill Gates, as most of us know, has his voice had been amplified because of the pandemic. But again, I want to be careful not to paint lust as something that by definition ought to be controlled, because in some leaders, it is absolutely, I would argue, a force for the common good. So it depends. You know, as in leadership generally, it depends.
Every paper the Kennedy School ends with, it all depends.
And indeed they should. Good paper.
Good. Kevin.
Yeah, sure. So we have nobody with their hands up, but we do have a few questions in the chat. So I'll read off the first one here. Do you consider Greta Thunberg to be lustful or insatiable?
I think, you know, she's so young. I don't feel fully comfortable applying the word lust, but you know, what can I say? She's got all the characteristics of someone who seems to be 100% consumed by this mission, by this zeal, by this drive. It is inconceivable to me that she will stop. So in that sense, I would say yes. Again, the word lust has a rather adult ring to it, an adult flavor. So I'm slightly uncomfortable applying it in that sense. But as a descriptor of how we define lust, which we define very carefully in the book, I didn't read the definition, but I think it's probably quite clear. I would say she falls into this category. And if you ask me the question in 5 or 10 years, the answer might well be, and I would argue is likely to be, an unmitigated yes.
That's right. Well, she certainly has drive.
Yeah, and insatiable. This consumes her.
Yep.
It defines who she is.
Yep. Good. Kevin.
All right. We have Michelle Liu. So you can unmute.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for the discussion, and thanks so much for introducing the book. So I was really curious because this sounds a lot like Alexander Hamilton's like Ambitious Men. And I think one of the things that Hamilton referenced was we have checks and balances that channels these ambitions so that they're most used in the proper ways. And I was curious, in your book, did you think about like, it seems like you came from a pretty comparative perspective, like in the United States, are there good institutions that channel these lusts in the most productive means possible? And can we learn something from that?
You know, Michelle, I'm going to be honest enough. Thank you. It's a great question. I'm going to be honest enough to say that if you had asked me this question 4 years ago, I would have answered one way. But because you're asking me in 2020, and I think we have learned, I think the American people, and I'll just stick to the United States at this moment, have learned, I hope they have learned, an enormous amount about the failures of what we considered, and I'd be very interested, David Gergen, in your response to the same question. It seems to me that one of the things that we've learned among several is that the American system of checks and balances, which was, as you say, Michelle, absolutely the whole word, the whole phrase checks and balances is conveys the message that the idea is to check any single individual or group of individuals who wishes to gain too much power, authority, influence, whatever, at the expense of the rest. I wish I could say that the American political system was healthy enough to look at what has happened in the last 4 years, how close we came, and there were some wonderful books written by, for example, Anne Applebaum and Timothy, great historian, Yale historian, Timothy Snyder, that warned of authoritarianism coming. And I would argue that we did come or have come or are coming closer than we could possibly have imagined, as I said, about 4 years ago. Whether we have the health, whether the body politic is healthy enough to close some of those gaps, to remedy some of those flaws, be they constitutional or congressional strikes me as very much an open question. And as far as I'm concerned, we should be, maybe we're not, but we should be much more concerned about flaws in the original system of checks and balances than, as I said, we could have imagined even a few short years ago. David, would you comment on the same question?
Sure. Well, I was in the Nixon White House during Watergate and the aftermath of Watergate. And I felt, as did my friend Bob Woodward and others, that we came very close to collapsing then. That Nixon was drinking so heavily and was so erratic that as he went down, he might pull the pillars of the democracy down, or the republic down. And that did not happen. The checks and balances held better than I expected. The courts with Judge Sirica, the Congress, the Senate, Howard Baker and other Republicans actually were a big force in getting Nixon hell out of there. The press, the Washington Post and others, but especially the Washington Post, was very, very helpful. There were just a lot of things in the system that worked better, but it did show us how vulnerable we were. We were fortunate to get through it then. I think we've done a less good job in the Trump years. And the checks and balances are pretty battered at the moment. And I think that's one of the things we need to work on restoring. That's part of what the healing process should be about, is to strengthen our civic life. It's something I think we desperately need to do. And I would like to be, I'm just not very optimistic about that all happening in the near term. I think your generation is going to make all the difference in the long term. And I do think the checks and balances can be restored. It's also worth remembering that when the founders were involved with this, they set up a constitutional system. They wanted things written into law, but they also, strongly committed themselves to building a first-class education system, so that we would have a civic life that would perform as informal checks and balances. Not everything is in the law. It is also just in what the culture is. And that is where I think we're much more vulnerable than we were. Going back to the whole point that Ron was making about 75 million versus 72 million. We're still at a perilous place, especially in my judgment. I won't go on with this, especially with a president who is, I think, might pull down some of the pillars. And in my judgment, it's becoming increasingly clear that his goal is to sabotage the Biden presidency.
Well, Michelle, I just want to say to Michelle, I think David's answer and my answer were similar in that where we are now is cause for concern, maybe greater concern about the capacity of checks and balances to carry the day than ever before in American history. We framed it in slightly different ways, but I suspect in the end, there's unhappy agreement on that.
Yeah, well stated, Barbara.
All right, looks like we have Monte up next. If you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself. Maybe not.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Good evening, Monty McMurchie, a Canadian in my bunker in downtown Toronto.
Good for you.
Power leadership is on one level so ephemeral, and lust cannot be contained forever because it requires a great deal of energy. And I remember the Carroll biography of Lyndon Johnson, the multi-volume, where he parses in immense detail the so much the lusting, but the longing Johnson for power. And then, as the two of you have articulated quite ably, is that once power is acquired, what do you do with it? And how do you deploy power? And then going to the philosophers, is leadership taught? Is leadership learned? Is leadership inchoate? Is it an adumbration of character? But now going to the present day set of circumstances, the tragedy is, in a sense, that lust, power, and leadership requires a citizenry that is able to stand up and speak truth to power without fear. And I'll say this not with any schadenfreude, my most profound disappointment are the elected enablers who are in fear of being primaried. And I'm referring primarily to the Republicans. And that, to me, is not what one ought to do if one is elected to office. Thank you.
I'm going to comment, Monty, on what you said. Thank you for the comment. So if I can piggyback on it to one of my hobby horses, because it's a natural follow-up on what you said. So I'm going to leave the Republican Senate out of this, not because your point is not extremely well taken, it most certainly is, but because the Republican Senate is doing or not doing what it does because of the base, because of the 72 million or the 40% or whatever number we want to assign to it, but a very considerable segment of the American population that remains, to those of us who don't belong in that category, rather mysteriously, but nevertheless, not just dedicated to Donald Trump, but in many, many, many cases, fervently dedicated. So the Republican senators, cowards they may be, but that at least explains your word primaried being perfectly apt, why they're doing what they're doing. So to my hobby horse, if I were queen of the leadership world, which I manifestly am not, I would have alongside every course on leadership, a course on followership. This, to me, what we're seeing with Republican senators and with the civic culture in this country the way it is I think maybe it was you, Monty, who used the word, a crisis of civics. In the old days, we used to teach civics in primary schools and in secondary schools. We teach it now, not at all or very little. It is much less important. The capacity to work together, to collaborate and compromise is because everybody feels they have to be a leader. Nobody understands that some of the time they have to follow. They have to go along, compromise, collaborate, cooperate in order to get the group work done. So I think, to me, again, as David said, I'm a provocateur. So to me, one of the sadnesses of the leadership industry is that it is so fixated on developing good leaders, which I think is extremely important, but I think it is probably of equal importance to develop good followers, defined as people willing to work together to support a leader who they consider in many ways to be good as an outgrowth of the civic culture, but who also have some conception of how to stop or at least slow a leader who is bad.
All right. Looks like there's time here for a question in the chat. This is from Benjamin Lefkowitz. Are there examples of great reluctant leaders, those without significant lust?
I wrote a book called Leaders Who Lust. What do I know about leaders who don't lust? Yes, of course. You know, I'm not saying that every great leader has to lust. I think we are saying that it is a trait that, you know, I mentioned the quote about Hitler, and I also mentioned that I'm as interested in Hitler as I am in Benjamin Franklin. In other words, to me, they're all grist from my mill. The book I call Bad Leadership has 7 different types of bad leadership, and they range from the lowest level, which I called ineffectual, to the most extreme, which I called evil. Evil leadership, where leaders do physical, psychological harm to some of their followers. That, to me, is grist for the mill. And I wish I could say, you know, that we have lots of exceptional leaders, great leaders who are devoid of this drive and passion. But I think to some considerable degree, for good or bad, leaders who stand out are characterized by a fire that is unquenchable. They don't usually retire. Let's say it's a corporate leader. Can you imagine Elon Musk or Steve Jobs or any of those driven let's move to the private sector. The same syndrome is in the private sector. They're not going to retire and play golf. They're going to be driven as long as they live to do what they do, which is to innovate, to lead, to do great things, whether it's an electric car or whether it's a spaceship. Jeff Bezos is another one. It's indicative of two leaders who lust, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, that they're not content to remain on planet Earth. They have to quite literally, as well as figuratively, shoot for the stars.
Right, and another question here in the chat. This is from Karen Corellis. Do the 5 less lean male, might these less shift for female leaders? I know we kind of touched on this earlier, but.
We did touch on them, but I'll just say, just to be very clear, who asked the question, Kevin?
This is Karen Corellis-Ruther.
Hey, Karen, just to be clear, there are 6 different lusts. And as I said earlier, you know, we don't have enough women out there to really have a clear understanding and a clear idea. But I happen to be someone, I've written a fair amount and taught women leadership for a good number of years. I happen to be someone who believes there are differences, some innate, some because of socialization between men and women, between men and women leaders. And I suspect the freedom, the unabashed freedom with which a male leader displays lust has to be more carefully concealed in a woman. And a woman on whom we do focus on the book, a woman you may have heard of by the name of Hillary Clinton, I would argue has been quite severely punished for her lust to succeed, which characterized her since she was a girl. This is not something acquired later in life. When she was a girl, she lusted to succeed. She was a standout in high school. Not necessarily in entirely good ways, because she was unabashed about running for class president when girls didn't do that. And I would argue she did succeed beyond anybody's wildest dreams, but she didn't get her ultimate brass ring, in part because the level of hatred directed at Hillary Clinton was striking, and I would argue in some considerable degree because her lust to succeed was so amply in evidence.
Do you think, Barbara, quickly, that women have emerged as better leaders in a crisis in the last couple of years?
Well, you know, David, you're using the pandemic. I think you're referencing the pandemic as an example.
In particular.
Yeah, I know you are. And that's been remarked on several times. I would argue the sample size is too small. I think it's great what New Zealand was able to do, but whether we can extrapolate from that, I don't know. Angela Merkel, who's a favorite of mine, the Chancellor of Germany, no accident. She was her earliest training was as a scientist. She has a PhD in, I don't know, one of the science, physics, I think. I think her PhD is in physics. So no accident. She knew how to approach. Sorry?
She was a nuclear engineer.
Okay, well, thank you. In any case, it's no accident that she was able to be so able with regard to the pandemic. By the way, contextual factors, Germany's healthcare system was in enormously better shape than was ours. So David, I think it's too early to say, maybe, but can I say with certitude, don't know.
I rarely hear you say that.
I don't know if that's a compliment or an insult, but I'm going to take it as a compliment.
It's a compliment, of course. Kevin.
All right. Well, it's 7 o'clock now. So I just wanted to thank you both. David, if you wanted to say any words here to kind of top it off.
No, I think so. I think we should salute Barbara. You all these years you've been writing these books and you've been persevering, and you know it hasn't been easy. You've been taking on the entire industry at times.
You noticed.
Well, I've known, yes, absolutely. I often wonder, how does she do that? How do they respond to all that? But you were terrific tonight. Thank you for this new book. And I do recommend everybody one of your recent books. In the last few minutes of our time together. It's a really interesting book. And I think a lot of people in the leadership industry need to read it. But those of you who are younger ought to take a look at it if you really want to understand some of the tensions in this field right now, the tensions that Ron has been dealing with and others have been dealing with. Barbara, thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate it. And thanks to everyone in on the call. Appreciate it, guys. Thank you, Kevin.
Bye.
Bye.
You're very welcome. Thank you.